Hello, I'm Tootight Lautrec, and this is Glitterature Alley, your back street, off the beaten path, under the radar, and beyond the pale place to sparkle up your senses as we discuss all things literary. Today is another installment of ShakeTube 2019, and today we're going to be looking at Measure for Measure, or as I call it, 52.5 Shades of Sin. If last week I bemoaned the lack of introspection, subtlety, and a generally satisfying read with King John, this week with Measure for Measure, we hit the sweet spot. And it's so sweet, I'm all aflutter with flattery for it. So the main thrust of Measure for Measure, if you will, and I will, is sex crime. Sex crime. Yes, sex crimes. Not quite 1984 perhaps, but not really quite that far away, which is why we skulk around under the radar here, and really it couldn't get much lower than the radar over here. But I digress. Now, Measure for Measure, or as I abbreviate it here, M for M, which is quite a different thing altogether as well. But in Measure for Measure, sex out of wedlock is not only a sin, but it's also illegal. A fact which every citizen in Vienna, where Measure for Measure is supposed to take place, is more than happy to turn a blind eye. The Duke of Vienna announces that he's going away to some undisclosed location for some undisclosed business, and in his stead, he's placing his deputy, Angelo, upright and pure Angelo, to take his place and enforce the laws of Vienna as Angelo sees fit. Now, Angelo is so very terribly upright and pure that one character says of him later in the play, in about, I think it's Act 3, Scene 2, line 87 and 88, that when he makes water, his urine is congealed ice. Now that's upright and pure, more likely uptight and perfectly hideous. So once the Duke exits the scene and upright and pure Angelo is in charge, we hear about this lusty lad named Claudio who gets his girlfriend pregnant. And Angelo, now that he's in charge, condemns the fornicator to death. And everyone's kind of like, really? Angelo? Death? I mean, it's bad. I mean, of course it's bad, fornicating and all that, but, I mean, death? And Angelo, pisses out an ice cube and turns around and says, yep, death. Dies tomorrow, off with his head, the top one. And here start the arguments about the types of sins and the grades of sins. And all of these arguments pervade this entire play of which sins are worse than others, which sins are bad under what kinds of circumstances. Do circumstances make committing a small sin to avoid a large sin commendable or condemnable? All these questions begin to start rising to the surface. So, large sins, small sins, medium sins, sins that are just right, or maybe not quite hot enough, pervade this Measure for Measure, and it's deeply fascinating and entirely satisfying. So we find out that the Duke has gone off to a monastery to disguise himself as a friar. Now, does he do this to spy on Angelo? Does he do it to actually escape from the world? Does he do it simply for a little, I don't know, brotherly companionship? Hard to say. It's unclear. But it allows him access to witness all the important actions and all the important conversations that occur throughout Measure for Measure, so that he can become the all-knowing observer and finally the savior of the play. So the Duke disguises himself as the friar. Angelo speaks from the chunk of rock that he calls his heart and proclaims the evils of lust. Claudio is condemned to die for it, having fornicated and gotten his girlfriend pregnant. And in desperation, Claudio decides to ask his sister, who has just entered the nunnery as a novice. She's not quite a nun yet, but if there's anyone who's upright and pure, it's his sister Isabella. So he calls upon Isabella and he asks her, could you please intercede for me with this guy Angelo, because, you know, upright and pure can plead the case to the upright and pure. So please plead my case. She says, sure, of course, you're my brother. I don't want you to die. You know, you sinned, but you should pay a price, but you don't need to die. So I'll go talk to Angelo. Well, it turns out upright and pure Isabella is exactly upright and pure Angelo's type. And Angelo's former puppy dog pure purity growls into a howling lust for Isabella. He propositions her. He says, sleep with me, your brother goes free. She's mortified, of course. Now, if this were simply a case of a man in power attempting to use his power to get some sex, it would almost be a cliche. Just another hoo-ha grabbing somebody's what's-this. It's a story that we've heard 150 million times before. And if that were all it was, it would be something that, you know, might hold our attention for a little bit, but it's not exactly new, and it's not exactly something that is tremendously compelling, because it's not new. But we have Angelo, who's really and truly tormented by his actions and his decisions. He's disgusted with himself. He's not just disgusted with himself because he finds out that he too is subject to lust. I mean, he thought he was so pure, and here comes this cute little nun, and something is stirring in him. And he's not just disgusted by that, but he's disgusted by the fact that at the lengths to which he's willing to go to get what he wants. He's willing to defile this poor young virgin just for the fun of it. And he can't understand it. He can't understand why he's feeling this way. He can't understand that he's going to pursue the path that he's pursuing. And he's completely disgusted with himself, as a complete mental, not mental breakdown, but more of an existential crisis in Act 2, Scene 2, lines 165 to 190. And it's really a compelling read, because he's grappling with his decisions and trying to figure this out. And the line that stands out mostly to me is, he says, most dangerous is that temptation that goads us on to sin in loving virtue. So he's all hot and bothered by this young, pure nun. And where does that fit in? Lust for a nun. I mean, I've been on the internet too, so I know a few things, but I think this is before the internet that Angelo is feeling all this. So Isabella, of course, rebuffs Angelo. She goes to Claudio, her brother, and says, well, I guess you're going to have to die. So you better say your prayers, and I'll help, and, you know, nothing we can do about it. But just so you know what a scum Angelo is, like, not only did he condemn you to die, he also propositioned me and said that if I slept with him, he'd let you go free. And Claudio says, well, oh, no, you can't do that. And then he says, well, I mean, that would be really bad if you did that. But, I mean, to die? I have to die for what I did? I mean, if you did it, it's not that bad. I mean, I've done it. It's kind of fun. It's, you know, it's not that bad. And of all the sins, of all the 7 deadly sins, it's probably the best one. And so there's again this conversation about what sins are better than others. And of course, the 7 deadly sins, guess what? They're all deadly. So they all have equal weight. There is no arguing here, but when you're approaching this through lived experience and you're about to die for having fornicated, you can obviously see how you think, well, maybe that's not as bad as it could be. Well, Isabella says, okay, now you disgust me. You're a pig. I hope you die like the horny pig that you are. I'm not going to do it. Forget it. You disgust me. All you men are pigs and I hate you. And off in the corner is the Duke as the friar, listening in on this, because he's supposed to be the friar coming to the prison to offer them last rites and offer them solace in their time of need. He overhears this whole thing. He steps in and he sets in motion tricks and traps and double crosses and lies to save Isabella's honor and to save Claudio's life, and to also give Angelo his comeuppance by making him marry a woman who he had jilted many years earlier because he found out that she had lost her dowry and wasn't up to snuff in his eyes. So I won't go through all the ins and outs, as it were, but the action explores all the gradations of sins, their philosophical implications, their moral implications. It's quite funny and also quite thought-provoking at the same time. It's very, very satisfying. It's funny, it's bawdy, it's intellectually stimulating, it's subtle and searching and entertaining. To see the vicissitudes of human emotion and to see the complex moral dilemmas play out in this play, which is, I guess, why it's called the play. So, in the end, 5 sparkle stars out of 5 for Measure for Measure. One of the best plays I've read. I prefer the tragedies mostly. This was delightful because it was funny. It was delightful because it gave me something to think about. There wasn't any straining to try to see what it must be like on the stage, but also using this new Kittredge Shakespeare was enlightening as well, because it goes through some various productions, and there's apparently a BBC production in which there's a lot of kneeling and standing of the women to create a sense of power or disempowerment. And so all of these power dynamics are something that I could keep in mind while I was reading this. Whether I agreed or not, it was still interesting to see how this might play out on the stage. But I didn't even need that. I just loved it in its own right. There wasn't any effort that was involved in trying to envision this, because it was so real. These people's dilemmas were so funny and horrible and weird that it kept me interested the whole time. So I love Measure for Measure. I love you. And I'd love for you to pay attention to the world, wherever you are. Don't be afraid to stare. Pay attention. Until we meet again, I'm Tootight Lautrec.